All right, Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 7, Vietnam, with the section the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Just on our map, here's Vietnam that runs down along the coast, and this little cutout here, this is known as the Gulf of Tonkin. In August of 1964, in the middle of the presidential campaign between Goldwater and Johnson, two American ships had been operating with the South Vietnamese Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin off of the coast of North Vietnam. This, in and of itself, this was not known to the press. This was a secret mission. The fact that the American Navy had been operating with the South Vietnamese Navy was not known to the American press or public or Congress at the time, but they were engaged in military conflict with the North Vietnamese without the knowledge of the American people. This is going to kind of come back to haunt the American government. But regardless, in 1964, what happened was a message came into the president that these American ships had been fired upon by the North Vietnamese Navy. One time, and then a slightly larger time, a day or two afterwards. President Johnson back home, what actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin is a little fuzzy then, and it got fuzzier as time went on. President Johnson made political hay of this issue. Anything happens in the middle of the presidential campaign, it's going to make political hay. So if you remember from earlier in the block, Johnson is running as this experienced elder statesman against Barry Goldwater, who he portrays as this trigger-happy nuclear cowboy who's going to bring the United States to war. Johnson gets on television. He's looking very statesman-like. He says that American ships have been attacked in an unprovoked fashion. He calls up memories of the last time American ships were attacked in an unprovoked fashion at a place called Pearl Harbor. Johnson goes on television and says, "I do not want a wider war," implying, of course, that Goldwater does want a wider war. But Johnson says, "I do not want a wider war," but he would also defend the interests of the United States against communist aggression. That if American ships are being fired upon, the United States has to respond. Johnson then goes to Congress and says to Congress, now remember, this is the post-Kennedy Congress. They are generally supportive of President Johnson. They are still an anti-communist Congress. Johnson goes to Congress and says, "I want your approval to defend America and American interests in South Vietnam against North Vietnamese aggression." The power to defend America, defend American interests, and American interests are defined as defending South Vietnam from aggression of the North. Congress agrees, and with about an hour of debate, this was not a heavily debated piece of legislation, Congress agreed and just gave to President Johnson the complete authority to conduct military affairs in Southeast Asia. Voted on it, and then Congress, what Congress basically did was they abdicated their war-making responsibilities to the president. Gave up its war-making powers, gave up its oversight powers, and handed President Johnson a blank check for carrying on a war in Southeast Asia. No one knew when it might end. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution doesn't have an end date in mind. It just says defend the interests of the United States with military force. Johnson had, if you remember the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, as it was called, based on what Johnson said about it, you'll completely understand what this resolution was about. Johnson said that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was like grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. That's President Johnson in a nutshell. He's very earthy. He's known for having meetings with high important congressmen sitting on a toilet. He'd be sitting there in the Oval Office bathroom, and he'll say, "Oh, bring in Senator such and such," and he'll just be sitting there, his pants down around his ankles, on the toilet, and just start yelling and screaming at this particular congressman for something that he wanted to get out of him. Johnson, like we said, he could turn on the charm, and he could be very earthy. Also, he had a stock of dirty jokes also. As time went on, the circumstances of this incident in the Gulf of Tonkin became fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier. And today, we're not even sure if there was an incident. between the North Vietnamese Navy and American ships. Johnson himself was not very certain. Johnson said years later, for all I know, the Navy might have been shooting at whales out there. But Johnson took this opportunity to gain control, total political control over a war in Southeast Asia that now he was going to go fight. Congress had abdicated its responsibility. The incident that started the war was not clear in anybody's mind. So the American involvement in Vietnam, the American military involvement in Vietnam at least, was off to a very, very fuzzy, inauspicious beginning.